"Ma'am, this is a restricted area," the young man said, his voice laced with the kind of strained patience one uses for a lost tourist. He wore a crisp polo shirt with the logo of a major defense contractor stitched over the pocket. He held up a hand, blocking Caroline Walsh's path to the helicopter. "We have a sensitive diagnostic session in progress." Caroline didn't halt her slow, deliberate pace. Her royal blue coveralls, scuffed at the knees and stained with the faint, ghostly outlines of old grease marks, were a stark contrast to the contractor's cleanroom attire. Her long blonde hair was tied back in a practical, no-nonsense ponytail. She looked past him, her gaze fixed on the silent, menacing form of the AH-64 Apache sitting on the flight line. It was a beautiful, lethal machine, and it was broken. "I know," she said, her voice calm and even. "That's why I'm here." The contractor, whose name tag read Trent, let out a short, incredulous laugh. He glanced at his two colleagues who stood by the Apache's open avionics bay, holding tablets and looking important. They smirked. "With all due respect, we're the engineering support team. The colonel himself is waiting on our report. Unless you're on our access roster, I can't let you near the aircraft." Caroline finally stopped, her boots planted on the hot tarmac, the smell of jet fuel a familiar perfume in the air. She held up the simple, unadorned contractor's badge she'd been issued at the front gate. "The colonel is the one who called me." Trent squinted at her badge, his skepticism hardening into outright dismissal. It was a generic temporary pass. Nothing on it suggested she was a senior engineer or a government dignitary. He saw a woman of a certain age, with kind eyes and hands that showed a lifetime of work. A mom, maybe. A spouse who got the wrong directions to the family support group meeting. "Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said, his tone shifting from patronizing to condescending. "This bird has a ghost in the fire control system that 3 of our top PhDs couldn't isolate. We're running a deep-level data capture. It's complicated." He gestured vaguely at the mess of fiber optic cables snaking from a laptop to the helicopter's guts. "We can't have anyone disturbing the environment." Caroline's gaze drifted from the Apache to the organized chaos of their diagnostic setup. She saw laptops, expensive-looking oscilloscopes, and 3 men who were treating the machine like a laboratory specimen. They weren't listening to it. The real problem was that the Apache, callsign Valkyrie 25, wouldn't link its target acquisition and designation site, the TADS turret, with the pilot's helmet-mounted display, the AH-64. It was a catastrophic failure. The gun followed the pilot's eyes. If that link was broken, the Apache was blind and toothless. For 2 weeks, the bird had been grounded. 2 weeks of the Army's best aviation mechanics, followed by a week of Trent's high-priced contractor team, and they had found nothing. No fault codes, no fried circuits, no damaged fiber optics. They had swapped out every black box, every processor, and every wiring harness connected to the system. Nothing worked. The ghost remained. "I'm not here to disturb anything," Caroline said, her focus returning to Trent. "I'm here to fix your ghost." Another technician, a younger man with an aggressively styled haircut, sauntered over. "Trent, what's going on? Is she with the catering service?" Trent waved him off, a flush creeping up his neck. "She says the CO called her in." He turned back to Caroline. "Ma'am, what's your name again? I'll have to verify it with the tower." "Caroline Walsh." He typed the name into his phone, then scoffed. "Nothing. There's no contractor named Caroline Walsh cleared for this flight line. I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the aircraft and wait outside the perimeter. Security will be here shortly to escort you." Caroline didn't move. She simply crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. She had faced down far worse than an arrogant contractor with a superiority complex. She had faced sandstorms that could strip paint from steel, enemy fire that sounded like hail on a tin roof, and hydraulic failures at 2,000 feet over hostile mountains. A man like Trent was just noise. "You're making a mistake," she said, not as a threat but as a simple statement of fact. Trent's face tightened. The idea that he, a lead diagnostic engineer with a master's degree from MIT, could be making a mistake by removing an unauthorized civilian from a restricted military area was absurd. He was following protocol. He was protecting a multi-million-dollar asset. He was in the right. "The only mistake," he said, puffing out his chest slightly, "was the gate guard letting you wander out here. This isn't a museum, sweetheart. This is an active flight line." From across the tarmac, partially hidden behind the fuselage of another Apache, a man watched the scene unfold. Master Sergeant Reyes, a maintenance NCO whose face was a roadmap of 3 decades of service, lowered his binoculars. He'd been supervising a rotor blade replacement when he saw the woman in the blue coveralls approach Valkyrie 25. He didn't recognize the coveralls, but he recognized the walk, the calm, unhurried confidence, the way she held her head. He hadn't seen Caroline Walsh in 10 years, not since she'd retired as a chief warrant officer for a legendary maintenance test pilot and diagnostic savant whose name was still spoken with a mixture of awe and reverence in maintenance hangars from Fort Campbell to Bagram. The new generation, like Trent's team, wouldn't know her. To them, she was just some older woman, but Reyes knew. He knew that if Caroline Walsh was on this flight line, it was because God himself had failed to fix the helicopter and the Army had decided to appeal to a higher power. He watched as Trent postured, as his flunkies snickered, and as Caroline stood her ground, an island of calm in a sea of arrogance. He saw Trent jab a finger in her direction, his voice carrying on the wind, sharp and dismissive. Reyes had seen enough. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a number he hadn't called in years but had never deleted. The direct line to the 1st Aviation Brigade Commander. Caroline, meanwhile, ignored the threat of security. Her eyes were scanning the Apache, not the parts the contractors were focused on but the whole machine. She noticed a tiny, almost imperceptible shimmer of heat near the TAD's turret housing, a faint discoloration on the composite shell no bigger than a quarter. She saw a slight sag in a bundle of wires leading from the avionics bay toward the forward fuselage, a deviation of maybe 2 millimeters from regulation spec. The computers and sensors wouldn't see these things. They were looking for digital errors, for broken lines of code. They weren't looking at the aircraft itself. Trent noticed her gaze. "What are you looking at? Did you see a bird?" "Ma'am, you really need to leave." Caroline reached into a deep pocket of her coveralls and pulled out a small, heavy object. It was a simple half-inch ratchet, its chrome finish worn smooth in places from years of use. Wrapped tightly around its handle, secured with faded green parachute cord, were a pair of old, scuffed-up dog tags. The metal was dull, the embossed letters softened with age. The second technician snorted. "What are you going to do with that? Hit it until it works? That's not really how we do things in the 21st century. Trent held out his hand again. "I'm not going to tell you again. Step away from the aircraft." Caroline looked down at the tool in her hand. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. The dog tags were a constant reminder. A promise she had made. A life she had saved. Her mind flashed back, just for a second, a fleeting echo of memory that was more feeling than image. The high-pitched scream of a turbine struggling to breathe sand-choked air. The jarring shudder of the airframe after a hard landing in the middle of nowhere. The darkness of a makeshift shelter. The only light from a single red-lensed headlamp, her hands working by feel inside a mangled electronics bay, the pilot's dog tags pressed into her palm for luck. The feel of the ratchet in her hand, finding the one stripped bolt that held the key to everything. She looked up at Trent, her eyes clear and focused. The memory was gone, but the certainty remained. "You're right," she said softly. "You don't do things this way." Across the base, Master Sergeant Reyes was speaking quickly into his phone. "Sir, it's Reyes out on the flight line." "Yes, sir. It's about Valkyrie 25. "The consultant you called in, Walsh?" "Yes, sir. She's here. The problem is the contractor team is about to have her thrown off the base. They're calling her sweetheart and threatening to call the MPs." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Reyes could almost hear the blood pressure of the brigade commander, Colonel Matthews, rising through the phone. "They're doing what?" The colonel's voice crackled, tight with disbelief and burgeoning fury. "To Chief Walsh?" "Yes, sir. The lead contractor. Name's Trent. He's telling her she doesn't have clearance. He's mocking her tools." Another pause. This one longer, more dangerous. "Master Sergeant, keep your eyes on her. Do not let them touch her. I am on my way, and I'm bringing the battalion command team with me." "Roger that, sir," Reyes said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "The show's about to start." He hung up and turned his attention back to the scene. Trent had taken out his phone again, this time with an air of finality. He was making a call. "Yes, security. This is Trent Kincaid with Aegis Dynamics at the East Flight Line. I have an unauthorized civilian who is refusing to leave a restricted area. Yes, a woman. Blonde hair, blue coveralls. She's becoming disruptive. I need an escort to remove her from the premises immediately." Caroline watched him, her expression unchanging. She knew, with the quiet confidence of someone who has been right more times than they can count, that help was already on its way. The contractors thought they were in control. They thought they held all the cards. They had no idea who they were dealing with. They had no idea that the quiet woman in the faded blue coveralls wasn't just a mechanic. She was a legend, and the cavalry was coming. Inside the brigade headquarters building, Colonel Matthews slammed his office phone down so hard the plastic housing cracked. His aide, a young captain, flinched. "Get me Command Sergeant Major Rivera," Matthews barked, his face a thundercloud. and get me the files on Operation Enduring Freedom 2011, specifically the after-action report for the medevac of Chalk 4 in the Karengal Valley. The captain, wide-eyed, scrambled to his computer. Sir, which report? The one about the Apache that took ground fire, lost all primary flight controls, and still managed to limp back to base after being grounded in a sandstorm for 10 hours, the colonel snapped. The one they call the miracle at Firebase Phoenix. Find me the maintenance annex. Find me the name of the warrant officer who jury-rigged the flight control computer with a roll of safety wire and parts from a broken radio. As the captain's fingers flew across the keyboard, Colonel Matthews strode over to a large credenza against the wall. He unlocked it and pulled out a framed citation. It was a Distinguished Service Cross. The narrative described a chief warrant officer who, while under sustained enemy fire, performed a critical repair on a downed aircraft's fire control system, allowing its crew to defend their position until extraction. The recipient's name was listed as Caroline Fixer Walsh. The captain's screen lit up with the requested file. He stared at it, his jaw slackening. Sir, the crew chief on that flight, the one who fixed the FCC, was a CW4 Caroline Walsh. I know, Matthews said, his voice a low growl. She was my pilot. She saved my life and the lives of my entire crew that day. Now get Rivera and get the motor pool. We're going for a drive. Back on the flight line, Trent had hung up with security and was now radiating smug satisfaction. His victory was assured. The rules were on his side. Protocol was on his side. He had asserted his authority and was about to be validated by the arrival of uniformed men with sidearms. They'll be here in 5 minutes, he announced to Caroline, as if offering her a final chance to surrender with dignity. You can either walk out of here on your own, or you can be escorted. Your choice. Caroline finally shifted her weight. She took 2 steps toward the Apache, ignoring Trent completely. She ran a hand along the cool metal skin of the helicopter, her touch gentle, reverent. She stopped near the forward avionics bay, the one the contractors had been focused on. She didn't look inside. Instead, her eyes traced a path down, along the belly of the aircraft, to a small, unassuming maintenance panel just behind the front landing gear. A panel that had nothing to do with the fire control system, according to the schematics. A panel nobody ever bothered to check. What are you doing? Trent demanded, his voice rising in pitch. That's it. You're tampering with the aircraft now. This is a federal offense. He lunged forward, intending to grab her arm and physically pull her away. He was tired of being polite. This woman was delusional, a liability. But he never reached her. A sound cut through the air, a sound distinct from the usual flight line noise of APUs and distant jet engines. It was the sound of tires squealing on asphalt, of multiple heavy vehicles coming to a stop in a hurry. Trent froze, turning to see what the commotion was. 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans, the kind used by senior command staff, had screeched to a halt just 50 feet away. Their doors flew open, and out stepped a half-dozen figures in crisp Army combat uniforms. Leading the way was a full colonel, his face grim, his eagle insignia gleaming in the sun. Flanking him was a command sergeant major, whose own stern expression could curdle milk. The contractors gaped. Trent's face went pale. This was not the base security pickup truck he had been expecting. This was the brigade command team. Colonel Matthews strode directly toward the group, his eyes locked on Caroline. He ignored Trent and his team as if they were invisible pieces of scenery. As he drew closer, a slow smile broke across his face, melting the stern mask of command. Chief Walsh, he said, his voice booming across the tarmac. It's been too long. Caroline turned, a faint smile touching her own lips. Colonel Matthews, you're looking well. Better than I would be if not for you, he replied. He stopped a few feet from her, and then, in a move that sent a shockwave through every onlooker, he snapped to attention and rendered a crisp, perfect salute. It's an honor to have you on my flight line, ma'am. Trent's jaw hit the concrete. His brain stuttered, unable to process what he was seeing. A full-bird colonel was saluting this woman, calling her ma'am with a reverence usually reserved for visiting generals. The command sergeant major stepped forward, a thick manila folder in his hand. He fixed his gaze on Trent, his eyes burning with a cold fire. You're Trent Kincaid? His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. Trent swallowed, his throat suddenly bone dry. Yes, Command Sergeant Major. Mr. Kincaid, do you know who you were just threatening to have arrested? He didn't wait for an answer. He opened the folder. This is Chief Warrant Officer 4 Caroline Walsh, retired. In her 25 years of service, she logged over 4,000 flight hours as a maintenance test pilot on the AH-64 platform. She was the Army's lead subject matter expert on the Model D variant's integrated avionics suite. She literally co-wrote the maintenance manual you clowns have been using as a coaster for the last week. He paused, letting the words sink in. The other contractors were starting to look physically ill. On her third combat tour in Afghanistan, the sergeant major continued, his voice rising. Her Apache was forced down during a zero-visibility sandstorm, with no support available, and a platoon of Rangers depending on her aircraft for fire support. She spent 10 hours cannibalizing parts from a destroyed radio to rebuild a shattered fire control processor. The custom diagnostic protocols she invented on the spot, using nothing but a multimeter and her own brain, are now standard curriculum at Fort Eustis. He looked from the file to the ratchet still in Caroline's hand, the dog tags glinting. The pilot of that aircraft, a captain at the time, credited her with saving the lives of all 17 men on the ground that night. He gave her his dog tags as a thank you. That pilot, the sergeant major said, pointing a thumb at the colonel, was him. A collective gasp went through the small crowd of mechanics and crew chiefs who had gathered to watch the drama unfold. The story of the miracle at Firebase Phoenix was doctrine. It was a legend told to new mechanics to inspire them. They were standing in the presence of the legend herself. Colonel Matthews dropped his salute and turned his glare on Trent. My bird has been down for 2 weeks. My best people couldn't fix it. Your high-priced team of experts has spent 7 days running diagnostics and has accomplished nothing but generating a 6-figure bill for my command. I called Chief Walsh as a last resort. I asked her to come out of retirement for 1 day as a civilian consultant because I knew if anyone could find the ghost, it was her. And your first instinct was to call her sweetheart and try to have her thrown off my installation. Trent's face was the color of ash. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Caroline, at the quiet, unassuming woman he had dismissed so completely. He saw not a lost spouse, but an icon. Sir, there was no rank, no title. That's the point, son, the colonel said, his voice dropping to a dangerously low level. You judged her by her appearance, not her presence. You saw a woman, and you made an assumption. You failed to recognize quiet competence. You failed to do the one thing a good troubleshooter should always do, observe. You didn't look at her hands. You didn't look at her eyes. You just looked at your checklist and your ego. He gestured to Caroline. The floor is yours, Chief. Find my ghost. Caroline gave a single brief nod. She turned her back on the command team and the humiliated contractors and walked back to the Apache. She knelt down at the small overlooked panel near the landing gear. With a few quick turns of the ratchet, the one with the dog tags, she loosened the screws and pulled the panel free. Inside, nestled against a structural rib, was a small black junction box. A single wire, a thin coaxial cable, led out of it, and at the point where the wire met the box, the protective insulation was rubbed raw, exposing a hair-thin sliver of gleaming copper. The damage was almost invisible. Every time the aircraft powered up, the vibration of the fuselage caused the exposed wire to make intermittent contact with the metal rib. It wasn't a short circuit, not a full one. It was just a tiny random flicker of electricity, a whisper of static. Not enough to throw a fault code, but just enough to disrupt the delicate data stream between the TADS and the pilot's helmet. It was the ghost. Caroline's mind flashed back again, this time to the full memory. Bagram Airfield, years ago. A pilot, young and cocky, his face pale with shock after his first real firefight. He'd just returned from a mission where his gun system had frozen mid-engagement. The official maintenance report found no issues, but Caroline, seeing the look in his eyes, had spent all night going over his aircraft. She'd found an identical issue in the same spot, a wire chafed by a poorly secured clamp. She had fixed it, and in the morning she had briefed the entire battalion on the potential fleet-wide issue. That pilot had given her his unit patch as a thank you, another totem she kept in her toolbox. That's why she knew where to look. The institutional memory was not in the manuals, it was in the people. She pointed into the recess. There's your problem, Colonel. Trent and his team crowded around, their expensive tablets forgotten. They stared at the tiny frayed wire. It was a simple physical problem. A $1 wire clamp and 5 minutes of work. All their advanced diagnostics, their algorithms, and their PhDs had been useless because they had forgotten the most basic rule of maintenance. Look at the machine. The command sergeant major turned to Trent. Your team is relieved, he said flatly. Pack your equipment and report to the base contracting office. Your access passes are revoked. He then looked at the assembled Army mechanics. The rest of you, listen up. This is a lesson. Competence doesn't have a uniform. Expertise doesn't have a gender. You will treat every single person on this flight line with respect, whether they are a general or a janitor. You will never again assume you know more than the person standing next to you. Am I clear? A chorus of "Yes, Command Sergeant Major" rang out. Caroline, meanwhile, had already produced a small roll of electrical tape and a zip tie from her coveralls. She carefully wrapped the wire, secured it away from the metal rib, and replaced the panel. She tightened the screws with her ratchet, the dog tags giving a soft metallic click with each turn. She stood up and wiped her hands on a rag. "She's good to go, Colonel. I'd recommend a maintenance order to inspect the rest of the fleet for similar chafing on that wiring harness." Colonel Matthews just shook his head in amazement. "You never lost the touch, Chief." She just smiled. "Some things you never forget." A week later, the flight line was a different place. The story of Caroline Walsh had spread like wildfire. A new policy was in effect at the front gate. All visitors, regardless of their appearance, were to be treated with professional courtesy, their credentials verified without prejudice. Colonel Matthews had mandated a series of back-to-basics training sessions for all maintenance personnel, led by Master Sergeant Reyes, focusing on hands-on, holistic diagnostics over a blind reliance on computers. Trent was not fired. At Colonel Matthews's insistence, his company reassigned him. His new job was to work with the team at Fort Eustis to update the AH-64 maintenance manuals, specifically to include a chapter on lessons from the field, starting with the story of the chafing wire on Valkyrie 2-5. One afternoon, Trent found Caroline in a quiet corner of the hangar, sipping a cup of coffee and talking with a young specialist about the finer points of tracking and balancing main rotor blades. He waited nervously until she was done. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet. Caroline turned to him, her expression neutral. "Trent, I wanted to apologize," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "Properly, without the Colonel and Sergeant Major watching. What I did was inexcusable. I was arrogant, I was dismissive, and I was wrong. Completely. I'm sorry." Caroline studied him for a long moment. She saw the genuine remorse in his eyes. She gave a slight nod. "Apology accepted. I just have to ask," Trent said. "How did you know? Where to look, I mean. It wasn't in any schematic." "Experience," she said simply. "A computer can only find the problems it's been programmed to look for. It can't account for 1,000 hours in a vibrating cockpit, or the way a 3-cent clamp can fail after a hard landing. A good mechanic doesn't just read the manual. They listen to the machine, and they listen to the people who came before them." She tapped her temple. "The best diagnostic tool you have is up here. Don't ever let a laptop convince you otherwise." She offered him a small smile. "You're a smart kid, Trent. You just needed to be humbled. Learn from it. It'll make you a better engineer." With that, she turned and walked away, her blue coveralls disappearing into the cavernous hangar, leaving behind a legacy of quiet competence and a vital lesson learned on the hot tarmac of a sun-drenched flight line. The stories of women like Caroline Walsh are a testament to the fact that skill, courage, and expertise know no gender. If you believe in honoring the quiet professionals who keep our nation safe, please like this video, subscribe to She Chose Valor, and share this story so that their contributions are never forgotten.